Thank you for the invitation to speak. Greetings from the U.S. Greetings from Atlanta, Georgia, the poultry capital of the world, at least for everyone in the U.S. I'm Will Sawyer. I'm the lead economist for animal protein at CoBank. I'm very happy here to talk about a subject that, at least for me, and I've been an economist in the meat and poultry sector now for about 15 years. The topic of technology isn't something that we in meat and poultry have talked about as much as we have in the last 12 months. I guess that and work from home and COVID-19 and recovering from the pandemic are, of course, also subjects. But I think for many of the customers that we speak with at CoBank, this is a topic that's hard for us to minimize. And so I'm really happy to have the opportunity to share some of our views, share a little bit of our kind of outlook here when it comes to technology, because I do think that there's a lot for us to talk about. If you see here my introductory slide, you notice a number of sectors that aren't in animal protein. You'll notice on the grain side of things and specialty crops. I think when we think about our folks in the row crop sector, they're significantly further, I think, ahead of us than the animal protein producers and processors. But I think we're going to catch up. I think we're going to catch up more quickly than we might realize otherwise. But I want to give everyone who may not be familiar with CoBank a little bit of an understanding of what we do, who we are, who we represent. Well, CoBank is a part of the U.S. Farm Credit System, which is a group of banks that lend into rural America. And those are our constituents, those are our customers, and those are our owners as well. And so we look at rural America in these major sectors. Animal protein is, of course, one of them, but we also think about the infrastructure side of rural America and dairy and specialty crops and, of course, grain and farm supplies. So not only do we focus on those sectors, we write research on those sectors, and my colleagues, who you can see there on the top, focus on those sectors and talk about them. What's great for anyone in the audience who's interested in our views and my views on these subjects, and you can see there we're talking about rural broadband and milk prices in the dairy sector. You can go to our website and get that research free of charge. You don't have to be a customer. All you have to do is go to cobank.com and it's available there. And we're going to be talking about a lot of these subjects in our upcoming research, because I know that's in my pipeline for research as we look into the summer months here in the U.S. But let's talk about change. I know we've been thinking about change, and we've had a little too much of it, I think, in the last year, but there are some important reasons why we see technology being adopted at an extremely high rate in U.S. meat and poultry today versus where I might have said things could change in the last few years. And some of these are the drivers we've seen in meat and poultry for a long time. And we've been talking about population growth and income growth for a long time. But some of these things are not necessarily new, but they're priorities that are at a much higher rate today than they were 5 years ago. The importance of the impact on the environment. It's not just a political issue, it's a social issue, it's an education issue, and it's an agricultural issue here in the US. Many producers, but also consumers, care a lot more about it today than they ever have, and that's something that's driving change. Cost inflation. We've seen this run up in grain prices here in the US, and I know every producer and processor around the world is seeing that as well. But cost inflation on the feed side, the energy side, the labor side, these are all driving cost of production significantly higher year after year. And unfortunately for us in the meat industry, that rate of increase isn't slowing, it's increasing. Finally, animal welfare is something that we have, I think, been working more towards in the last few years than I think previously. But there's a lot that we can do to improve the quality of life and improve the conditions of our livestock. And that's something I'm seeing in beef, pork, and poultry. It's not just in one specific species. And then finally, the subject that we'll continue to talk about, I know for probably years to come, is COVID-19. What does it mean to technology, and how do the producers and processors in the U.S. adopt some of the things that we saw in COVID-19? How do they change their supply chains to try to minimize the risk that COVID-19 posed? So let's start with population growth and, of course, income growth. Both of these things are trends that we've seen for a long time. They're not changing. We've seen many economies around the world recover from where they were or close to prior to the pandemic. That's kind of a mixed bag depending on where in the world you're talking about. What's interesting to us here in the U.S. is that because our regulators and our government have put in significant stimulus into our economy, we see the U.S. consumer in a very strong position from a meat consumption standpoint. I know I can't say that in every part of the world, but I think that's a pretty safe conclusion here in the U.S. But that's going to be something that's going to drive growth long term, because when we think about 2050, who's driving that growth in income and in meat consumption is not where it has been historically. Where is it going to be? It's going to be in Southeast Asia. It's going to be in Africa. And while there are huge pockets of production growth, right now there's not the domestic supply to be able to feed those higher income populations and higher and larger groups of people. And both of those drivers are critical for the adoption, I think, of technology. Some we've been talking about, but we don't want to forget that part of the story. The environment, greenhouse gas emissions, methane. We are all becoming, I think, much more scientists when it comes to the impact of meat production on the environment. And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. What's important to us, I think, for the U.S. industry is to say we are getting better in the way that we are impacting the environment, as in reducing our impact, but we still have a good ways to go. I've highlighted here global animal protein greenhouse gas emissions on an average basis. There in the green line, you see today we're about a third of where we were 60 years ago. That's a really good story. You can see that on the U.S. basis there in the dotted blue line, the dark blue line, that's improving as well. But where we have the challenges in livestock and poultry is the fact that if you look at beef, it's in a very different situation in the U.S. than pork and poultry. And so that makes it the target of a lot of environmental activists who see beef as more of a culprit as opposed to a solution. What's interesting to us as we look at greenhouse gases and emissions in the beef industry is that the U.S. beef industry is far more efficient than many other parts of the world. And so is that an advantage in terms of best practices, in terms of exports? That's an important question for us to think about. But greenhouse gas emissions is something I know our regulators are thinking about, but I know our consumers are as well. We see that getting better, but we see that getting better in a far more quickly way in the next 5 to 10 years. Cost inflation. Inflation is something that you hear in a lot of financial press, but it's not this kind of inflation. I don't think anybody's expecting CPI or PPI, any of these large macro indications of inflation going up the way we see feed costs going up in 2021. This is U.S. perspective, so I know some countries are far worse, but for us as U.S. meat and poultry producers and processors, 27% higher cost of feed, and this is on a total basis when we're looking at hogs and cattle and broilers and eggs, 27%. We haven't seen double-digit feed cost inflation in over a decade. And obviously, we're well into the double digits, over 25%. But it's not just feed; it's also labor, it's energy, it's construction costs. Anybody that wants to build a chicken house in the U.S. has seen the cost of that lumber, the cost of that steel for the roof, the cost of the equipment on the inside is up at least 27%, sometimes more. So inflation in our supply chain is getting worse and not getting better. That's driving a lot of folks to think about innovation and technology to reduce those costs and reduce that burden. And then finally, this is my COVID chart to tell all the COVID stories I really can. As you can tell, it's not a map of COVID cases, but it shows how meat consumption and food consumption overall changed during the course of the last 12 months. And I don't usually like to give super long-term charts because you lose a lot of the story, but this is a great exception. And the reason is if you look at food consumption in the U.S., year after year, more and more of our food dollars are spent away from home in restaurants than spent in grocery stores for eating at home. And we've all become, I think, worse cooks in the US as a result. But the trend has been to spend more money away from home. And in fact, when you look at about 6 or 7 years ago, we flipped over from spending more of our food at home to more food away from home. And prior to the pandemic, over 50% of those food dollars were spent away from home. But over the course of just a single month, we went from spending 50 to 55% of our food dollars in restaurants and away from home to almost a third. And that rate of shift is a historic change that I don't think we'll ever see again. I hope we don't, because those food dollars there in March of 2020 were at a level that we had not seen in the US since the early 1980s. And obviously you can tell by that line that things are turning closer to normal, but we're still not back to where we were prior to the pandemic. More and more of our food dollars today are spent at home than they have in over a decade. You can see that this level that we're at now, this 47, 48%, we've kind of hit a ceiling. And I think one of the reasons why is that we've lost so many restaurants over the course of the last 12 months. These aren't restaurants that just lost sales, they had to close. And we think that may be in the neighborhood of 1 in 6 or 1 in 5 US restaurants. And that's despite a huge amount of stimulus into that food service sector. And that's going to be important as we think about the rebound. So when we think about the backdrop here, when we think about the context of what's driven technology, is that we've seen a lot of volatility in US meat, poultry production and processing. We ask ourselves kind of where do we go from here? But one thing that I hear time and time again from our CoBank customers around the country is that they are looking to make these investments sooner than later. The feasibility studies are not 12 or 24 months long. They're trying to think in the matter of the next few months, what investments can we make today to try to reduce our environmental footprint? What can we do to try to reduce our costs? What can we do to try to address some of those changes that we've seen impacting our business models in a really significant way for years, but I think especially in the last 12 months. And I think what's important for us to think about, and I can say this pretty comfortably as an economist in the industry, is that I do think the level of profitability here in 2021, despite higher feed costs, is at such a level that I think they have the capital, they have the funds, whether it's from their lender or from their own balance sheet, to be able to make these investments. And I think that's why, while we'll see some technologies in the next few slides that probably will never come to commercial scale, but some will. And I think today is a really important time in the life cycle of the industry, having recovered from what was a historically difficult time during the COVID-19 pandemic, to be able to make some of these investments. So let's start at the beginning. Let's start at the beginning of the life cycle and of our supply chain at the producer. And when I think about the technology that I hear from our customers, what they're really trying to do is not totally rewrite the way that they raise their animals or feed their animals. What they're trying to do today is think about their herd, about their barn, their house, whatever their metric is, on a far more granular level than they have historically. And so there was a time that we thought about production and our efficiency on what was coming into our meat plants. And that took investment in and of itself. And then we started moving it back onto a farm basis. And then we started moving it back onto a house by house basis. And today, what we're trying to do, what we're trying to find the right technology to tell us, is not how that house has performed, but how each individual animal within that house, within that barn, within that herd is performing today. And it's that level of granularity that's going to fix an unbelievable number of challenges that we see in our supply chain. And so let's look at a few of those. The first is data. First, we have to get the information. And I think, unlike our folks in the row crop space in the US, I think animal ag doesn't have the production data on an animal by animal basis in the same way that I think precision crop farming does. And so we need to make those investments. And so how do we get that data? Well, we need sensors, we need robots, we need the ability to capture that information. because we know the animals are there. We know that they're telling us things. And that's what's really interesting, is that how we're using sensors to identify odors, to identify sounds, to identify humidity and temperature. And all of this data has to also be transmittable to the producer, to the grower, in a way that they can make decisions. And without being able to make decisions, it's just data, you know. And as someone that uses Microsoft Excel every minute of the day, data doesn't do very much unless you can tell a story and make a decision with it. And that's where a lot of the investments are going today, is to try to capture that data and tell that story in a much more easy to understand way for folks who may not be veterinarians, who may not be, you know, lifelong producers. And that's critical for our industry to grow, as I know in your part of the world it is as well. And then we think about the environmental side. You know, the producer side is really where the waste and the environmental impact is. Methane emissions, animal waste, litter. These are all real focuses of producer groups around the world, and that's especially true in the US. What I think is interesting is that folks are finding ways to use that waste in not a wasteful way, but in a very economical way, and it actually benefiting the bottom line of the producers. That's methane digesters. That's, you know, that's using litter in a much more economical, environmentally friendly way. And what we realize, and this is true if you look at that water drop, is that in that waste, there's a lot of different forms of value. The nutrient side of things, that's something that's important to our crop side of things. Water is something that we, you know, have learned is a very valuable commodity. It will be one of our most valuable commodities, I think, in the decades to come. And so there are investments that are happening there on the producer side. When we think about the meat plant of the future, they really need the farms to make these investments so that they can make their investments within the meat plants. You can't have one without the other. And one of the key variables here is to improve the uniformity of our livestock. That's in size, that's in weight, that's in quality, that's in come to market. All of these different variables are huge constraints to our ability to automate and mechanize and improve the efficiency of our meat plants. And a lot of times when you think about automation and mechanization, you think about, you know, getting rid of the workforce, or, you know, really reducing your head count. And from what I understand, and from what a lot of our customers are telling us, they've had enough demand now for increased production and for increased value added things that maybe the automated machines aren't capable of doing, that they don't see it that way. They see this more as an opportunity to reduce the impact on their team members, that trying to make it less labor intensive is a critical way of improving the longevity of their workforce. So livestock uniformity is critical to being able to do that, because the variability of our herds is a huge constraint there. Reducing the impact on our team members, as I said, you know, we see more and more competition in rural America, maybe in your part of the world as well, on how our team members see their opportunities within meat plants versus other manufacturing jobs. And as more technology comes into rural America, we do see there's a lot of competition there. So we want to keep our team members happy. We want to keep them productive and keep them there for the long term. Because in the end, the more efficient our meat plants are, the more meat they can produce. You know, when you think about our population increasing by 50%, doubling their income, you know, one thing that the U.S. and I think many parts of the world still have is a real low-cost producer perspective. And the more, though, that we get in a very expensive way of raising animals and processing them, the more that we need to make investments on trying to reduce those costs and to keep that advantage. That's critical, I think, for our ability to export, as the U.S. has done in a major way in 2020. But I think that's going to be something that'll be critical for U.S. and global food supply going forward. And then finally, you know, and we can't forget the most important and the most kind of critical part of our supply chain. It's our customers and our consumers. And let me differentiate the two there. Our customers are the restaurants, they're the grocery stores, and our consumers are the folks who are actually cooking our food and eating our food. And we need to think about those two groups in a little bit of a different way. The first, I think, is a little bit of an aftermath of COVID-19. is that we saw that there was a lot of risk in our supply chain. There was a lot of, possibility of interruption. And we saw that in the U.S. This time last year, many of the meat plants on the beef and pork side of things had lost maybe half of their whole industry's capacity. That was because plants were shutting down, plants were having to slow down, our workers were getting sick. And so, we really were concerned. And so as an industry, we saw our capacity bottom in March of last year. And so it's improved since then. But we knew that there was risk in the supply chain there in the meat plants, but also in the restaurants and in the grocery stores. And so I think the meat companies in the U.S. are thinking today, and I think in other parts of the world as well, is how do we make our supply chain more resilient, and how do we help our customers, those restaurants, those grocery stores, have the supply they need, and I think in a much more safe and sustainable way. Because one thing that's important is that the workforce within the meat plants has a lot of skills that you don't see in the grocery store. And so being able to have that centralized is important. So for example, case-ready meat, case-ready beef in the US. We see some of the biggest names in the beef industry today making investments, hundreds of millions of dollars in expanding case-ready capacity because they're trying to reduce that risk that we see in the grocery stores. On the restaurant side of things, we saw there that you had a workforce who was very specialized, and in many cases that makes sense. That's a price point that makes sense. But we do see that at a lower price point, at a price point where volume and scale is critical to profitability, that meat companies have the capability of bringing in some of that further processing into the actual meat supply chain. So investments are happening there. What about our consumers? Our consumers, as I mentioned, they found themselves having to cook and eat at home way more than they had in a long time in the U.S. I think that's probably true in other parts of the world as well. And so how do we give those consumers convenience? And this is an inconvenient part of the COVID-19 pandemic, is the fact that we lost our ability in the meat industry to provide that convenience because so many of our workers were out and so many of our plants were closed. And so how do we add that value add, that further processing, those meals, that ready to eat side of our consumer base? How do we provide that in a more automated, mechanized way? That's something we haven't done in a major way historically. I think there's a lot of opportunity investment that's happening there. Something that we're seeing in the U.S. in just the last 12 months are these ghost kitchens. It's a restaurant that has no face, a restaurant that has a name. And I think as we look going forward, we're going to see more of that investment happening. Because what we need to remember in the meat and poultry industry, and this is true, I think, in the U.S. and other parts, is that if we don't do the right things in our industry to invest, to innovate, to reduce our environmental impact, there are going to be companies and there are going to be substitutes out there. There's going to be the alternative protein space. And that's going to be a space that's not going to disappear, or I don't think take over our industry in anywhere near the near term. But we know that we have to invest to show our customers and our consumers that we're improving our impact on the environment. We're reducing our costs. Because one of our key advantages when it comes to our customers of today is the fact that for the most part, they view our product as tasting better. That's something that I think we can hold on to that. But they also view the value and the economics behind our product as being significantly better as well. And so both of those areas are something we need to hold on to. But we see investments happening in that space, and I don't want to be too alarmist, but if you see the rate of growth in just investments, not to mention the growth of the sector, that's something that you can see on the horizon. And it's not just plant-based sector. You see it in the fermented protein space as well, and in cultivated animal protein as finally. And while these may give you the sense that plant-based is the only opportunity for the alternative space, I would very much disagree with that, because the cultivated sector is one where you see the greatest potential and also the greatest hurdles, but these hurdles are coming towards them at an increasing rate. They're getting more efficient. They're getting at a lower cost. And so I think that's something for us to definitely watch. finally, let me give some conclusions and some considerations for us to kind of think about before we talk about some of your questions. I think the meat and poultry industry today has a million good reasons to invest in this technology, to invest in some of the innovation that we see that's starting here in the U.S., but it's happening in other parts of the world as well that we're bringing here into our supply chain. I think about cost of goods sold, the cost of raising animals, the cost of processing animals, the cost of getting that meat into the marketplace. That's a trend that doesn't seem to be slowing, and it seems just getting higher and higher, and the rate of inflation continues to increase. Because we really, in the U.S. and I think other parts of the world, really view ourselves as some of the best in the world at what we do in producing animal protein. But we need to make these investments because sustainability is key. It's in the mission statements of some of the biggest meat companies in the world is sustainability. But when they say sustainability, it's not just on the environmental side. It's sustainable to our workforce. It's sustainable to our profitability, sustainability to the competitiveness of the markets that we produce in and the customers that we try to sell to. So sustainability has a very broad definition, and I think that's where technology can have a role. I think the technology, success starts at the farm. I think for these, for us to get better in the right way and in a long-term, with a long-term horizon, we got to invest in our production side of things, not just in our plants. And I think, our labor, our team members, our workforce, they're the heroes that made 2020 not any more disruptive than it already was. And I am very happy to see so many meat companies trying to reduce the impact of our somewhat, difficult jobs, trying to make them more easy on our team members. That's very good to see. And I think that's really going to pay significant dividends. And then finally, I think this is a real golden opportunity in the meat and poultry space. They have, so many good reasons to make these investments. And I think whatever area that we want to look across our supply chain, from producer to processor to retailer, there's a lot of opportunity there. And I think there's a lot of innovation for us to look at. That's my contact information. I'm Will Sawyer from CoBank. I appreciate your attention in the last few minutes and looking forward to your questions.